Welcome. And we are so pleased to be able to be with everyone today for a special segment, a heart-to-heart segment about grief and a better path forward. We know that when we discuss mourning and loss, that's often a difficult conversation, particularly in social settings or in a business environment. And yet, if we are not addressing grief in a meaningful way, it can truly lead to health, both physical and mental health challenges. It's incredibly important for us to understand, particularly in our current environment, how we can go about having these conversations. What are some of the new normals around grief and mourning that we need to be aware of? Knowing how we can identify in ourselves if we or some of our loved ones are at risk. And then also to think about how can leaders and managers approach their teams in a different way, in a more compassionate way, so that they can be more engaged, they can get the support that they need. I am so pleased to once again have Shelley Chopra, friend, GW4W board member. She is the president of the nonprofit International School of Story and a principal at Lumina Health Partners. Our three esteemed speakers that we have today are good friends, known globally for their work, and bring just such a wealth of knowledge. So want to welcome Nancy Board, who is one of our co-founders and CEO of Global Women for Wellbeing, a clinical services manager at the Washington State Employee Assistance Program. Nancy is an expert EAP operations and business professional, experienced in corporate health and well-being globally. That's how we originally met through that network. A true leader in workplace mental health advocacy around transformation, trauma response, women's issues. And for anybody that's ever heard her speak or been involved in one of her workshops, you know why she's sought after as a speaker and a facilitator. We are delighted to have Dr. Dale Atkins with us, licensed psychologist, researcher, and author with over 30 years of experience as a lecturer, media commentator, and relationship expert. She's frequently a guest expert on NBC's Today Show, among other television and radio outlets. Her most recent book, which we would highly recommend, is The Kindness Advantage. And our third speaker today is Lynette Davis, author and writer. She's a mental health advocate and love agent championing wellness for entrepreneurs and small business owners. She is the author of the book, Success to Die For, breaking down assumptions about anxiety, depression, and suicide and their impact on business women. She is also part of the GW4W leadership team, and we are just so pleased to have all of you with us today for this important conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
To start the discussion, we wanted to kind of focus on what is different about mourning and loss now versus before the pandemic. So it'd be great if each of you could share a little bit about what you've seen out there about some of these differences and why these are so important to recognize. So Dale, would you like to start?
Happy to start and happy to be with you, all of you. It's a very good question. I think one of the things that's different is there's so much of it. There's just so much that has to do with death and grief and mourning around us, a time that we've never experienced before. And we are alone, so that usually when we are engaged with mourning and surrounded by death, we reach out to other people and we have other people near us. And so we don't. And another piece of that is the mourning rituals that we would normally do, whether they are based in religion or custom, cultural custom, for most people, they're not available right now. And so that really impacts the way we process the death and the way we process the mourning and how we can internalize it and work through it if we don't have those familiar, comforting ways available to us. I think another thing that's going on is that it is cumulative because every time you turn on the news, you're faced with more death. There's always more death, and it seems to be constantly coming. And it's predictable yet unpredictable because you talk to someone and you're not sure how they've been touched by this. And then I will stop and share the commentary. But I also wanted to say that for those of us who have experienced death in the past, This triggers death. It triggers our mourning. It triggers our perhaps incomplete mourning. And it can activate memories and grief and sadness and lack of concentration, all kinds of responses that we may not have been ready to process. And we may have thought we were done mourning someone. And then we are right back in there in ways that are that we're unprepared for. So those are just a few of the many. And I'd love to hear what other people have to say about it.
Great, Nancy?
So just to let everyone know, I'm having an unstable connection, and I'm only picking up parts of the conversation. So I believe the question was around grief and mourning, but I'm sorry, I didn't hear the full question. Mim, could you repeat it?
Sure. So what is different about grief and mourning now in our new normal that you've seen?
Okay, thank you. What I would share is that I just want to start off by saying grief is something that goes on the inside of us. Grief is internal. Mourning is sort of this outward expression of that grief. And so for me, as an example, my father died a month ago, and the outward expression of that grief that would typically be shared through a service, a ceremony, a ritual, was a very private ceremony and mourning that I had on the day that he would have been laid in the ground. And I had it in my backyard with my husband and my dog. And I had a good friend in another location who was doing a ritual around this with me at the same time. And so I think for all of us, our grief is internal, and it may or may not be expressed, and certainly not in the same way in terms of how we mourn those losses. So I think it's that's one of the biggest differences, and it's incumbent on all of us to just recognize that and be aware of it.
Wonderful. And Lynn, what have you seen in your community?
Yeah, so I would say the biggest difference between beforehand and now is that we are in a collective grief right now. Whereas before it was something that was very personal. It was something that happened to us individually, and we felt that pain, and we had to cope with what was going on within our lives, within our circles. But right now what we're experiencing is a collective trauma, not just within the United States, but within the world. So we are mourning and grieving together collectively as a human race. And that's the biggest difference. It's kind of like something along the lines of one kid lost their toy versus all the kids now can't go to the playground because a bulldozer came and knocked it over, and we have absolutely no idea how we're going to play anymore. And that's, you know, that's the way I kind of look at it. It's a big collective sigh and grief that we're all experiencing right now.
You know, I loved how you guys expressed grief. It's a personal process, personal journey. It's internal. How has this changed you? How has this impacted you in your personal lives? Nancy, I know you're going through it recently in this, and you know, Dale and Lynn, you mentioned you have also gone through it in your lives. As you went through the journey of grief, how did it change you personally?
Who are you asking that to, Nancy?
Nancy, yeah, let's start with you.
Sure. Grief for me is just a process of life, to be quite honest. I don't know that it ever necessarily ends. I think it shifts. I think certainly my experience with grief and anyone's experience with grief is unique to that individual person. And so for me, as Dale was talking, I was hearing some of it, Dale, is that this grief that I'm experiencing with my father, of course it brings up the death of my mother. Of course it brings up other losses that I've had in my life. And so during this time of worldwide collective grief, I actually feel comforted in a very maybe spiritual way that I'm not in this alone. And I never once felt that way. Even the day that my dad died, I was helping someone else live. I was actually on a work call that someone reached out who wanted to live. And I was involved because that's part of my work in helping this person get to an emergency room. And he chose life the day that I was getting texts from my siblings saying that my dad passed away. And I think about that literal crossing over and back and forth of what's going on. And so I don't feel alone in this process at all, because I keep thinking of everyone everywhere that's going through a very similar experience and story. And so for me, grief just kind of ebbs and flows. And that day it was flowing, it was a little higher, but it peaks and it flows. And I honestly feel this universal connection with the collective grief that gives me some comfort as well.
That's so profound, Nancy. Thank you. Dale, what do you think? What has been your personal experience with it?
Well, I really appreciate what Nancy said and can relate to it also because I lost my father 25 years ago. He was a relatively young man. He had early Alzheimer's. And so that grief, I was mourning him almost before he died, and then I was mourning him when he died. And I've been mourning him every day since. My mother passed away this past December at the end of the month, and she was 97, almost 98, and very vibrant. And I've been mourning her through this period in a very unique way because I have the opportunity to spend a lot of time with her memory and with her photographs and walking around the garden where she would love to be. And during this time, the only reason I'm glad she's not here is because it would have been very hard to go through this with her and being away, and just at this time she would have hated having to not see her friends and be engaged. Grief dramatically changed me. All the griefs that I've had have changed me. And I hope they've made me feel more connected to other people's grief. I'm very quick to cry when I hear a story of someone's loss. And I feel that's something that I really like about myself, that we are all connected no matter who we are. We never know someone else's experience of grief, but we know what it can be like to have that profound experience within ourselves. And I feel that with grief, there's a resilience that can happen. There's a transformation that can happen. And I think that Nancy's comment about not feeling alone, whenever we talk about taking care of ourselves and we go through a really bad time, we have to remind ourselves that we're not alone. And now it's front and center. We are so not alone. I think that for me, when people reach out to me now and tell me stories about my mother in particular, I love listening to them. I have the time to listen to them. I encourage her friends calling me and talking about her. And so we have time, I have time to really remember her without having to be in a particular week or, on a particular anniversary, but it's all the time. And I realized that with my dad, I've always had him with me all the time. Now it's really intentional that I am being with my mother many, many moments of the day. And I invite her in. I sit in chairs that she sat in, and I think about places we went to. I think about my life with her. And I feel I'm indulging in magnificent memories that are helping me while I miss her. That's something I wouldn't have had we not been through this time.
That's so beautiful. Thank you. Lynn, what about you?
Sure. So I have not recently lost a parent. So I think that this is actually good, so I can bring a different perspective about what grief can look like for people who are not personally experiencing a parental or a grandparent death. Because grief, I like that both Nancy and Dale both said that grief looks different for different people, and what we grieve is different as well. For me, my experience with grief has come in different forms. It's come in the form of being an ally and then seeing a friend die by suicide. It's been in the form of witnessing a cousin cry because her friend was killed in a car accident, and witnessing that. My grief comes in a form of collective grief when once again we see another brown body or another Black body being killed over and over and over again on Facebook. My grief comes in the form of my own personal experiences with things that were very precious and dear to me, a friendship, a client loss. So all of these things are all bundled together for me, and just experiencing the trauma of these things happening over and over again. And then the daily trauma of having to avoid this constant death by paper cuts, you know, of passive aggressive behaviors and passive aggressive silences when things need to be said. So how that changes me is it takes me a while to process grief versus I know some people like Dr. Dell said that she cries and everything like that. It takes me a while. Most of the time people are like, man, she's really handling that really well. It'll take me a good 6 months sometime before something actually really registers and clicks in for me. So how I handle grief, how grief looks like for me, is typically me rolling up my sleeves and getting work done. And sometimes that can look like, oh, she's not dealing with her grief. And it's like, no, it just takes me a really long time to process my grief. And in the meantime, what I try to do is I try to control what I can control. So in the midst of this going on, I jumped on being a peer support specialist for first responders. Like that's how I handled my grief, by helping people who were on the front lines. You know, I started launching more peer support groups and being more active in those things, because those are the things that I could help, because I had that emotional stability right now to do that. I have a capacity to open myself up to other people who don't have that emotional capacity. And that's how I personally am dealing with grief, and how grief changes me. It makes me kind of go into let's get her done mode until I'm ready to really sit down and reflect. In the meantime, I'm journaling out every day how I'm feeling, even if I'm going, you know, I'm not really feeling anything right now, but right now I really just want to help somebody else until I can really fully process how angry or frustrated or hurt I am.
That's really beautiful, and you make a really good point, Lynn. Grief looks different for different people. And I also think grief is not something that's just associated with someone passing on, a death of a person. Grief can also be a loss of a relationship. Lynn, you raised some examples like that. And a lot of people in times such as this, where there's isolation, where there's extra pressure on families and relationships, some are becoming stronger and some are falling apart. So there is grief associated with that too. And yes, it is different for everybody, and everybody has their own mechanism to cope with it. The key is identifying it and knowing you are going through it and knowing what you need to cope with that. So thank you for sharing the examples.
Could I just add one thing about that, if I may?
Yeah.
Sure.
I think that the loss of routine, the loss of that which is predictable, the loss of, you know, feeling that there's something we can rely on and that we've always relied on, can trigger this sense of mourning that people don't necessarily recognize. And they say, well, why am I feeling so irritable, or why am I feeling so sad, or why am I so constantly disappointed? Or all of these things. You say, as you say, try to understand what it is and don't judge it. Because, well, you know, okay, so I can't have my normal routine. Why am I so upset? Because that's part of your life, and that's what you do, and that's how you function. And I also just want to underscore what Lynette said about, you know, kind of rolling up her sleeves and getting in there. I think companies really have to understand that some people, when they are mourning, They want that routine. They want to be able to get back to work. They want to be able to jump into their job because they can focus and they can really contribute. Whereas other people, they cannot do that. And again, the individual differences are not just in the immediate days following a loss. They really last, and they may, as Lynette said, 6 months later, and that's normal. That's within the normal range. And I think somehow we have this idea that we're supposed to, go through it in a number of days. And most of us go back to work kind of sort of shocked still, and we don't understand why we can't focus. And so I know we'll talk about that a little bit later, but I just wanted to underscore that this loss is not just about the death of a person, as you're saying. It's the death of routine. It's the death of familiarity. It may be the death of a job, of a relationship, of so many things. And that's the mourning.
Yeah.
And I love this discussion about it being this social mourning, because I've heard people talk about, am I ever going to be able to go back to my local restaurant,
Right,
where I had a social network, or the coffee
Right.
shop
right.
where I used to be with everyone. And there's now some fear around that. And so there are some people that feel kind of guilty about feeling sad when they have people around them that may have had bigger losses, or what they perceive to be bigger losses. But I think what's really interesting about this conversation is that, we each are going to mourn in our own way. But if we're not experts, if we're not trained in kind of identifying when things are, when we really need some extra support, it would be great to kind of hear from all of you that work directly with people, in crisis situations. What should you be looking for, either in yourself or those around you? And when is it a real red flag to say, we need real support here? So Lynn, do you want to start?
Yeah. So, so I have a cheat sheet for this. So one of the things that we do as peer support specialists is we come up with, some people call it a prevention plan or something like that. So the one that I use in particular is called WRAP, which is Wellness Recovery Action Plan. And within that plan is basically you list out things, and I'll show you my pocket one. This is a WRAP plan. And literally, number one, you write down all your wellness tools that you're going to use. You write down your triggers that you can recognize ahead of time. What does daily maintenance look like? And then what are the tools that you would want, or the people who you would contact during an opportunity for a crisis? And having these things ahead of time kind of lets you know what's going on. I always say be proactive about your mental health, and be proactive, period, about your life. We know that there's going to be loss. We know that we're going to be stressed. So if we know that these things are going to come, we cannot avoid them, then being proactive and writing these things down, literally documenting them, is how you can tell for yourself, at least within yourself, that something's off. I journal, so I know that if during my journaling exercises, I'm looking back and I'm going bleh, meh, versus my other entries. And I've had journals where I was like, January the 1st, meh, versus, oh, I'm so excited about life right now, and I'm going to do this, and here's my goals. And I'm having a whole pattern of life sucks, what's going on, then something's off for me. And so I typically say that literally document it, write it down. If you don't like writing, record it. We have nice little recorders on our phones. You can have a recording diary.
Absolutely. Now, those are great tips. And I know, Nancy, you work with some people that are on a daily basis almost, that are on pretty severe crisis. So really interested in some specific things that you might be able to share that people can look out for.
Thanks, Mim. And I think for all of us and for our audience listening, I think one of the things that maybe all of us take for granted is our ability, and as women, this tends to be a skill that many of us had from an early age, and that is paying attention to other people. I mean, how often are we paying attention to other people as just part of our regular life, sometimes more so than we pay attention to ourselves. And Lynn, spot on about being aware. Being self-aware is a big part of it. But for those people who maybe are less self-aware and always looking for the state of being with other people, some really simple tips can be to do that with yourself, certainly, but to also be looking and checking in with people on a regular basis, just asking some simple questions like, how are you right now? How are you feeling? Something seems a little bit off, or, in the times when we could touch someone, to be able to put just a gentle touch on someone and say, yeah, I noticed this today about you. It's making an observation. It's calling attention to the fact that you see this other human being that's there and that something's a little bit off. And I think one of the things that all of us can do that it's so underrated in our society is our ability to listen and be present and hold space for someone else. I mean, that's why one of the gifts that I've been trained in as a mental health professional, but I've also cultivated in my life, is that ability to just sit without answers, to sit without judgment, to sit without thinking in advance, what am I going to say to that person? Because I think I know what to say to help them. Oh my gosh, the gifts that we can give by just being there for another human, to say something out loud, is huge. And so what we're doing right now, we're listening to one another. Just allowing space for that is something that all of us can take away tangibly and go do in our life today.
Power of presence, right? The simplest but the most profound act we can do for somebody is just being present. Yeah, that's beautiful.
Really is. And I know, Dale, you've done a lot of work in PTSD and identifying and dealing with that, and helping people then turn some of that into strength over time. It'd be great to hear a little bit about this.
Sure. And I just want to, kind of underscore what was just said. I think that the presence for others is something, as Nancy said, most women do quite well. And pardon me, I think that having that presence for ourselves and having that non-judgmental voice, because we have a very critical and judgmental voice often, just get through it. Don't worry, there's not a big deal. Don't pay, that's ridiculous. Why do you feel that way? All those kinds of things. That's not being present for ourselves. That's not being a good listener to what our body is telling us. And I think that kind of putting your finger on your pulse, so to speak, and really being able to take a breath and stop, take a pause and listen to what's going on inside. The kind of listening that Nancy's talking about is so important. And we tend to do it more with others because it's also more acceptable to do with others. And I think what we need to do to have true self-compassion is to do it with ourselves and to listen, and when we need to, act on it and say, what do I need right now? I need to talk to somebody, or I need to take a walk, or I need I need a hug, or I need whatever I need, or I need to stop this critical voice in my head. And I think that when we can be honest with ourselves and say, I'm really overwhelmed, or I just don't think I can do this. And sometimes we see this through a lack of concentration, when we're biting off somebody's head, when they just ask us a simple question, when we're driving somewhere and we forgot where we were going, when we come downstairs and we forget what we came down there for. All of these are indicators that something's a little off. And when we breathe and whatever we do, if we meditate, if we take some moments to just kind of sit with ourselves, we can then see what's going on. And then, as Lynette said, maybe write it down, maybe talk about it, maybe do some art, whatever we do, to see it in a different framework, because sometimes we become so myopic we can't see. To your question about working with people who are going through trauma, for many people this has been very traumatic, and is responding to this period in a very different way. Some people are grateful that they're home, that they can work from home. Some people can't wait to get back to their office, if there is going to be an office. I mean, there's all kinds of responses. And there isn't one size fits all. Just like there's no one way to grieve, there's no one way to get through this. I think what's important is that we try to challenge the way we usually think about things to see how we can best adapt. And because the situation is constantly changing, we have to be very flexible to stay connected with the people that we want to stay connected to, and limit the connections with people who are not good for us at this time. And if we happen to be living with those people, try to find a way to disconnect in certain areas, not have your triggers, not have your, not be triggered off with certain things that might drive you to a response that isn't going to be healthy for you. Think about what you're going to say before you say it. And then to also challenge the way we think about things. Just because the way we thought about something before doesn't mean it's going to work now. And then what is the meaning in this? What are we doing here? And what's happening to us? Nancy and Lynette talked about really having this be meaningful and helping other people and understanding how important that is. One of the most important things as you are suffering yourself is to help other people. And you realize you're not alone, not only in your suffering, but you activate a whole different part of your brain when you are giving to another person. And when you find meaning and you can be grateful for what is left and what you really appreciate, you can do that. And this will transform you. Deaths transform us. And the question is, do they transform us for good, or do they transform us for not so good? But it's an opportunity.
You touched on this a little bit. There was a common theme that we as women are naturally inclined to hear others, take care of others, but do we give that same kindness and compassion to ourselves? I want to go a little bit deeper into it. As we think about grief, how we get in touch with it, how we navigate it, are there nuances to that journey looked in from the lens of not just gender, but even economic class or race? Do those factors, make a difference? Nancy, I'll start with you.
Oh, I think all of the above. I mean, yes, of course it does. Everybody's background, experience, race, culture, gender, creed, you name it, how we live, what our life experiences are. I can look a certain way, and yet my life experience may be so different than what you think it is, just by what you make up about me, the story you make up about me based on what you see. Chances are, because this has been a pattern in my life, yeah, my story's been very different than what you might think it is. Absolutely, for every person around the planet, all of those things come into play. Some people are under much more pressure than others based on cultural norms and how we're expected to be and operate. And so, yes, at least for me, Shelley, it's been a lifelong journey of self-discovery and staying true to who I am in my grief, in my joy, in my ability to speak, and my ability to stand in my own personal truth. And yes, I think for every human that's out there, we have so much opportunities and yet many obstacles to kind of navigate in whatever that looks like for that person in their life.
Yeah. Lynn, what's your perspective on it?
Yeah, so very much so in agreement with Nancy that yes, all of these factors are definitely, you can put all of them into play. For instance, just mental health care looks different. Healthcare period looks different. This is something that we say with GW4W all the time, that research has not been sufficient for women because most of the research subjects are male. So, that expands into emotional health care as well. And we'll even take it a step further in how that's distributed based off of gender as well, or race or ethnicity. So, and then you have to take into consideration cultural norms as well. So, for instance, I come from an African American background, and coming up in the neighborhood that I came up in, talking about things like stress and anxiety and depression were not a normal thing for us to do, because we have been fed and have projected onto ourselves this stereotype that we have to be strong. And it has bled into society, into the doctor's office, so that when we show up into those doctor's offices, they go, well, they're strong. They can have, they have a higher threshold for pain. And so we're not going to treat you as equally as somebody else. And that itself is a traumatic experience. That itself is a cause for grief. So there are so many different things that contribute to how we're affected. And that's just one of them. And yes, of course, class, if you don't have insurance, you're not going to be treated the same, and you're not going to have access to the same kind of healthcare. So we can go on and on with that one. But
Yes, we can.
Yes, we
It's
can.
very much a practical reality, right? It's one thing to say, oh, this is how we navigate and this is how we feel. The we behind it, it's complex, it's diverse, and we have to go a level deeper and look at it from the lens of gender, race, class, creed. It is personalized, so it begs us to really meet it where it is when we're looking at how do we help somebody. So very well said, Lynn. Thank you. Dale, your take at it?
Yeah, and I really, I'm in so agreement and so much agreement, and also learning so much. And I just want to say also, it's also within the family. I mean, there are certain responses that are acceptable in a family, and everyone feels that they're supposed to respond in that way. And when they don't respond in that way, they're not so welcome in the family. I will share with you that I was at a funeral when one could attend funerals. And there was a teenage boy who was mourning. We were there, he was burying his grandfather. And he was 16. And he was so close to his grandfather. He was crying and crying. And I overheard his dad say to him that tears were unacceptable. He better buck up and be a man. And this was literally at the funeral. And I overheard it. I won't go into the details, but I had a very long conversation with this young boy. And I also had a very long conversation with his father, which probably was an inappropriate time, but I was really not handling my own experience of what I had witnessed very well. And I think that it also comes to when people go back to work. They say, I'm supposed to, I had my days off, and now I have to get back there and I have to present because that's expected of me. And I have to leave my grief at home. I have to put on, again, we bifurcate. And so I think that there are expectations within a community, within a culture. I think in general, we're pretty death averse here, and talking about issues that have to do with death and dying. Even within a family, if you want to talk about, gee, mom, did you write your will? What do you want to get rid of me? I mean, there's all kinds of responses that people walk on eggshells. We're getting better, but there are still people who really are not that comfortable at all with anything that has to do with loss or death. I know someone who lost a job and didn't tell his family for 3 months. And he got dressed every day and went to the train and went into New York and did whatever he did. And then he came home and didn't share that profound loss and disappointment for 3 months. And I'm not sure he would have then, but somebody called and said, how are you doing without your job? And it was just, my point is that we have to look at the individual, and the individual's background is part of it, but the messages that each of us has been given as to what's appropriate and what's inappropriate, and how we go along with that or how we challenge that, is really also very, very, very important to look at when we're talking about grief and loss.
Well, I really resonate with the story that you told about the 16-year-old, because I had a similar experience when I was 10 and my grandmother passed away. And it has been many, many years, but even now, that just brought like a visceral reaction that somebody was not acknowledging where I was and what I was feeling. And I think this really gets to, are there specific do's and don'ts about bringing this up? I know that it's different in different cultures, but all three of you are trained. And I think when if people are really uncomfortable, are there specific do's and don'ts, simple ones that we can share to help people have these conversations when they get into these discussions around loss?
Yeah.
So go ahead, Lynn.
Yeah, Lynn, go ahead.
Yeah. So a don't is definitely the experience that Dr. Dale shared with the suck it up and get over it. That's a don't. That's a definite, very obvious don't. Another don't, sometimes depending on who you're talking to, because it's so easy for us to just want to go hug somebody. But if a person has, because I feel like I have to say this, if a person has had trauma in that experience, they might actually be touch averse, and you might actually need to ask permission first before you touch somebody. I just felt like that was really important to say. A do is to basically come out and just ask, do you feel like talking? How are you feeling? And be aware that sometimes you have to kind of be a little bit more aware of a friend, because it's so easy for us to go, well, how are you doing? Oh, I'm fine. And then you have to kind of know your friend or your colleague and go, okay, how are you really doing? That's a go ahead. You can do that. So just like really simple things like that, just asking, how are you feeling? Do you feel like talking? Holding space for somebody, like we've said a couple of times. I'm reminded of, I was reading, I forgot which book I was reading, because I read about 50 books at the same time. But somebody, the person in the story was saying that they were going through a really bad time, a really tough time. And they had friends come over and they were all talking and lamenting with them. And I might be mixing up the story of Job with this story. And, and they're like, oh, what's going on? What did you do wrong? Or, why are you feeling down? Come on, snap back into it. You're a pastor, or you're this, or you're a leader. So you have to come out here and lead. Those are all don'ts. But one person came to the person and held space for them. And the way they did that was they came and they washed their feet for them. And they just sat with them and just quietly sat there and washed their feet. And that's a basic way of saying, I'm here. You are important to me. And you don't even have to literally say those words. And sometimes, like you were saying, people are death averse, and people do that because they feel like they don't have the right thing to say. So I think sometimes just giving yourself permission to say, I don't know what to say, but I'm here for you. If you need me, I'm here for you right now. I'm listening to you, and you're important to me, and I care about you. That's it.
Yeah, Lynn, I couldn't agree more. I think the way we approach this subject and so many others in our life is so much simpler than any of us realize. There's so much we can do to be present for each other. So a don't, I'm totally in agreement with you, Lynn, is you don't need to say much to me because you don't have my answers. I have my answers. I don't, my experience may be very different than yours. So I don't need to hear your experience at the moment, even though that's your desire to help me. What I need is just to know you're there. Just that presence, that silent presence. And I think as people, we think we have to have answers for everyone. We have to know what to say. And for me, the times in my life when I've been witnessed or accepted and felt the most support is just like this, just like we're doing now. I can look at each of your eyes and I feel you're listening, you're there, you're not interrupting me, you're just letting me be. And gosh, that's so underrated. It's so underrated in our society. So whether that's a leader in your community, in your home, at your workplace, just being able to ask that question, how are you? Or if you need anything, I'm here. Or just to sit there in silence with that person while they weep, while they manifest whatever is coming up for them. It could be anger. You know, it could be sadness. It could be grief expresses itself in lots of different ways. So don't think because somebody's angry, they're not necessarily grieving. So just to be there and be comfortable holding space in the uncomfortableness can do wonders for others. So that's my extra do and don'ts to add to this.
I totally agree with both of you. And I think we can take cues from the person. I think that, you know, we can say, you know, when you're ready, I'd love to hear about your sister. You know, I know you were so close to her. And I think also when you show up, say, you know, I'm going to the market and I'd love to, you know, I'm going anyway, and I'd love to pick up something for you. Or show up with, you know, if you know they're gluten-free, a gluten-free meal, something like that. Because sometimes when you say, well, just tell me what you need.
Yeah.
What I need is not to be asked what I need. What I need is for somebody to take care of me. And, you know, I'll be over at 6 to walk the dog. I mean, these are the kinds of things that when somebody is so unable to keep themselves together in a way that they have to then be concerned about the other person. The other thing I think that's really important is when you say I'm here for you, understand that that means something for everybody, something different for everybody. I want to know how you're here for me. If you're here for me to sit with me and let me cry, that's great. But if you're somebody who's going to be really uncomfortable if I'm crying, then you're not going to be here for me in the way I need. So then I have to think about when I can talk to you. When I said before about being with people, be with the right people at the right time if you have that choice. And don't go to a dry well. Don't go to someone who's going to tell you all about their loss if you want to feel better, and if you want to feel comforted, because you're not necessarily going to feel better. You just want to feel heard and held. And when someone says, oh, you know, I lost my dad, and they go into their story, it's very confusing. It's very, very confusing. So I think a don't is, you know, I lost my dad and I know exactly how you feel. No, you don't. You don't know how I feel, but I don't want to tell you that. So I'll kind of sit here and let you tell me about your dad, which is extremely enervating. The other thing I think we don't want to hear as a mourner is you'll be fine. You'll be fine. And the other thing is if someone lost a spouse or lost a child, I hear this a lot. You know, you're still young and you'll be able to find someone you'll marry, or you're still young, you'll have another baby. Or if someone has a miscarriage, immediately there's such discomfort. And this isn't a judgment, it's just an observation. There's such discomfort. And to your point, I think, Nan, there's just, people are uncomfortable in silence. And that's what people need when they're mourning. They need silence, but yet people feel they have to say the right thing. And another thing that can be very, very hard for people, even if they believe this, is hearing from someone else, you know, everything happens for a reason. And at that moment in time, that may not be very comforting, or she's at a better place. You don't know what their experience is of heaven, hell, whatever. And even if it is true, that may not be what they're experiencing or need at this moment. So we have to take the room temperature also and say, what do I think this person needs? It's easier with a friend who you know, but with a coworker, it may just be, you know, I know you experienced a devastating loss and I'm glad you're back at work and we're here for you. And the other thing is, and I don't really want to get into this, but I know that Lynette, you spoke about it when you talked about people who are touch-averse. We also don't know the relationship between the person who's mourning and the person who died. They may have had a very, very difficult and fraught relationship, which they care to or not care to share, because we assume that if somebody lost someone close to them, that they might have had a positive relationship, or maybe we're more comfortable thinking that, when they may have been the victim of abuse by this person. They may have been, you don't know their story. As you said, Nancy, we don't know anyone's story, but we try to put on a story. And all we need to do is let them know they're not alone. And that isn't very hard if we kind of keep our mouths shut and we really show up, and we're not texting and we're not thinking about or doing anything else.
I want to share a little personal story with you guys. So I'm a mom. I have two boys. And with this COVID, and my boys are two very different personalities. My younger one is ball of energy, physical energy. He's a boy's boy in football team. You know, we often joke Armand needs a production around him. No matter what he's doing, he needs people around him. He feeds off of that. And with COVID, having to move to staying at home, it has been particularly difficult for him because the way he interacts and relates to people, relates to himself, is externally. Mm-hmm. And, you know, talk about mourning and grief. And it took me some time to pick up on it. He was still fine, but he's more resigned in his room. He's playing Xbox a whole lot more. He's sleeping later and later at night and waking up later and later in the day. He's not interested to go out in the family for walks. So, you know, we get into, my God, your room is dirty. My God, you're not getting out. Let's do this. And then kind of the light bulb went on. Well, maybe he's mourning the different, not having a choice and loss of the way he connects. This is how he's dealing with it. So you've talked about how do we do's and don'ts on, you know, somebody who's mourning. Would you have any words of advice for parents who, you know, communicating with their children, going through this process, for whom, you know, maybe the mourning and loss is not an actual death, but a loss of what they relate to, what their normal is? Nancy, I'll start with you.
It's a great question, Shelley. I think, yeah, I can imagine different scenarios in my mind of what this could look like and how different it could be for every single parent. But I think it still boils down to many of the same skills. It's to really try to be present for your children, whether they're smaller, whether they're teenagers, to interact with them in a way that's meaningful for them. That's easier if they're older. But even if they're young and you're seeing that there's acting out behavior or something's different, and you say to yourself, that's not how they normally are. Shelley, and you gave a great example with your son. It's not how he normally is. Oh, I'm noticing they're sleeping more, or I'm noticing that there's this activity going on. To just sit with that person, to call that out, to just explore it. And again, if they're younger children, they may be demonstrating through artwork, through play, through an imaginary friend, what's going on in terms of their own loss. So it's about, again, attending and paying attention to what's changed for them in their behavior. Because children, people, we all behave differently when something's going on. Typically, we do, especially those of us that are more conscious of it. But again, and I always say, open the space for feelings to be okay, no matter what they are. Open the space for death and grief to be okay. Open the space for a conversation around loss. Because even if it's a small child, a bird will die, you know, an animal will die. You might see something, they're going to see something in a movie or a picture or whatever that illustrates that there's a loss. So it's all around us, whether we choose to see it or not. It's always there. And I think there's plenty of opportunities to just open up that conversation in a gentle way. But Dale, back to your comment, it's if you're going to open it up, then you need to be aware. You need to be present. And if you're going to be there for somebody, your children, then make sure you're taking the time to do that, because it might go on for a half an hour or an hour or more. And what a beautiful thing.
They might not want to talk
to be
right
able
there and
to have that connection with your children and to do that in a loving way.
Yeah, or they might not want to talk right there and then. Like, you know, a teenager, you might just get monosyllable grunts back, you know.
Yeah.
No,
It's okay
but
to show up.
it's very possible that that's true, and probably likely that it's true. However, acknowledging someone's emotional state is really important for a kid of any age, for a person of any age, to hear the words, you know, things just don't seem to be normal, are they? They're not. You have every right to feel, you know, that your world is turned upside down. I feel that too sometimes, right? And so that they don't feel so alone. And, you must really miss your friends. And I know how important it is for you to be the center of, and to be able to articulate what you feel they may be feeling in little bits, not a whole, this is the big lecture. It's just an acknowledgement, and that it kind of allows people to relax and make their emotional world be okay. That, they don't have to act it out. It's okay. And it's okay in this family also, which is really an important message.
I don't know if anyone saw the article that's been in social, well, all across the media. I think it just was in the past 24 hours, of the 7-year-old boy that put together a prom for his babysitter that recognized that she was in. And so we're talking about, like, adults talking to children, but sometimes forget that children can be very intuitive too.
Yes, yes.
And there was another story written by a journalist. It was in the New York Times. She had gotten COVID-19. She was isolated at home with I believe her child was like 2.5, 3 years old. You read this, Shelley?
Yeah.
And
Yes.
she was like, "Oh, mommy, feel better." Like, was bringing the Clorox wipes and putting it under the blanket with her mother. And we forget sometimes that children see and feel at such a deep level, and acknowledging that and letting them express how they want to care for you, I think, is a great way to connect as well.
Yeah, they're so perceptive, and we take that for granted sometimes. And you know what? Holding space for kids looks different. So my nephew is here with me as well, although he's not here today, because all of my family, we all have been living in very close quarters with each other. But he came and he brought me a little coin, and I'm like, I'm busy, I'm trying to work. And I was like, no, let me just give him attention because he's 5, so I take the little coin, and he runs downstairs and he comes back upstairs with his Catboy mobile. and I'm supposed to buy the Catboy mobile for him. And, in my head, I'm like, so I play along, and I realized that that's what he needed at that moment. He just needed his titi. That's what he calls me, titi, which is a short for tia, which is aunt in Spanish. He just needed his titi to just play with him at that very moment, just play along with him. And that's holding space for a child. That's what it can look like, when you're team auntie.
Well, that's great. We are almost at the top of the hour. This has been such a wonderful conversation, and just so much great information shared and personal stories. Because we also go out and talk to businesses, just a short comment about the typical 3 days of bereavement leave at organizations, and what you would like to say about that. What, especially in this next normal for organizations. So I personally have seen this in my own career, and people come back after those 3 days, and in some instances you have a lot of support, but I would say the vast majority of organizations out there still could start to think about this in a different way, particularly in this next normal. So Nancy, I'll start with you. What do you think businesses should be thinking about when it comes to bereavement?
It's a great question, ma'am. And I think beyond a doubt, for any organizations or any HR managers or benefits folks who are listening to us, is to have this conversation, because we know that it's a number. It's an artificial number that's given that perhaps represents, go have whatever it is you need to do. You've got a death in the family or a death of a loved one, go deal with it and come on back and get back on board. And that's not the message, of course, that any of us want to send. And I think with this collective grief that we've been talking about, bereavement could be issued for every worker out there now, for every person who's lost anything, whether.
Oh, I think a little bit of a freeze.
Yeah, I just lost power a few minutes ago.
This is the world we're in.
Yes.
Loss of internet connection.
Right, when talking about loss.
Right, 100%. Well, while we're waiting for Nancy, Dale, would you like to comment?
I would, and I really agree with where I think Nancy was going, which was everybody is grieving. But to your 3 day, I mean, you might have seen me shaking my head. First of all, if you have a funeral and then there's always things related to it. I mean, traveling, trying to get people notified, dealing with wills, dealing with moving people's belongings, all of this. This is all part of the grieving process, and it can take a really long time. I'm aware that Sheryl Sandberg, after she lost her husband, was very influential in trying to put through a program which was successful and has been modeled, I think, by MasterCard and some other companies, large companies, where there's 20 days if you lose a spouse or domestic partner or a child or a stepchild, and 10 days if you lost a parent or a sibling or a grandparent, and 5 days. I mean, I think that we need to be flexible, and I think we need to be aware of what is going on. But I think more importantly is understanding, again, grief is different for everybody, and what people need is different. And to have a conversation with your employee about what it is that they, first of all, what they would like you to say, if anything, to the coworkers, to the working community that they're in, and what they'd like you not to say, and also for people to be able to approach the topic. I also think that people who are in the business of setting policy should get information from the people who are working in their company. What do you need as workers in a bereavement policy? What do you want? What do you think would be helpful given your experience with the company and also with your own experience of mourning, to have more of an interaction? Because this 3-day thing, it just really, it isn't sufficient on any level. And I think that because also when people come back to work, they kind of often feel guilty that they're not kind of back in the saddle right away, and they feel very self-conscious and then guilty. And if they're losing their concentration, they feel more isolated also if people don't ask them how are you doing today? Because generally we say, how are you doing? I'm fine. But how are you doing right now, as Lynette said, at this moment? So I think that it's a complicated issue, but we cannot ignore it.
Right. And Lynn, I'm going to give you the last word because I know you've worked a lot with entrepreneurs, which is a little bit different than like larger organizations. So from your perspective, what kinds of advice would you give to smaller companies and entrepreneurs?
Yeah, really quickly, because I'm going to be mindful of the time. I think the best thing that we can do is to be non-judgmental. And what I mean by that is when people are just returning to work or to their offices and things of that nature, you are tasked with not going, your performance is horrible right now, and let me write you up because of that. We are literally just coming back and grieving, and no, I don't have that all together right now, not yet. So being more compassionate and non-judgmental are two things that I think leaders can do and small business owners can give themselves as well, because half the time we are our own company. So throwing ourselves in there and going, I have to do all this and I need to do that, it doesn't look the same, and we have to be mindful of that.
I think that's great advice. Well, we are just a little bit over, and what an amazing conversation. Thank you so much, Nancy Board, Dale Atkins, Lynn Davis, for this just really meaningful, personal, and insightful conversation. I know that there are lots of tips that people have gotten, and we do hope for everybody listening that you're taking good care of yourself. If you have experienced a loss, please know that you're not alone. Please reach out to us if you're looking for support. We do have a network of people both in the US and around the world, and we are happy to get you connected to credible resources should you need that. Thank you again. We look forward to having another heart-to-heart conversation in the near future, and we hope that everybody stays safe and is well. And here's to a sustainable, healthier future. Thank you, everyone.
Hear, hear.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.